In the dead of night in the year 1542, within the silent, sprawling Forbidden City, a dozen palace maids, armed with a single yellow silk rope, nearly succeeded in strangling the Son of Heaven, ruler of the Great Ming dynasty. This was the Renyan Palace incident, a shocking event in which a group of powerless, oppressed women launched a desperate rebellion. With all their might, they pulled the rope tight around the emperor's neck, but in their frantic haste, they tied a dead knot that failed to constrict this. Combined with the last-minute betrayal of a single maid who ran to inform the empress, caused the only attempted regicide by palace women in Chinese history to fail. This bizarre tale sounds like pure fiction. Yet, when one opens the history books and discovers that over 200 palace maids died of unnatural causes during the Jiajing Emperor's reign, the assassination attempt begins to look less like a random act of madness and more like an inevitable eruption of despair. Historical records describe Emperor Jiajing as volatile and capricious. What kind of tyrant was he? How could a ruler with such absolute control over his empire fall prey to a plot by the most humble of his subjects? Behind this lies a secret, the story of a master political player at his most frenzied, selfish, and pathetic. To understand Jiajing's madness, one must first understand his obsession, the pursuit of immortality. This obsession was deeply rooted in his bloodline and homeland. Hubei, Jiajing's birthplace, was home to the sacred Wudang Mountains, a center of Taoism that had been designated an imperial family temple since the time of the Yongle Emperor. Raised in this environment, Jiajing was steeped in Taoist rituals and the occult arts from a young age. He deeply believed in the core Taoist principle that his fate was in his own hands, not in the heavens, a conviction that would define his life. When he was unexpectedly thrust upon the dragon throne, extending his own life indefinitely became the ultimate goal of his reign. However, to achieve this goal, he had to overcome a formidable obstacle: the Ming dynasty's scholar official class, renowned as the most powerful in Chinese history, armed with Confucian ethics. These officials possessed the legitimacy and collective strength to correct the emperor's behavior and limit his power, even daring to interfere in his private life. Jiajing's own grandson, the Wanli Emperor, was so beleaguered by them that he famously refused to hold court for decades. Jiajing knew that if he could not subdue this group of meddlesome bureaucrats, his quest for immortality would be forever disrupted. Thus, from the first day of his reign, a protracted, epic battle between imperial authority and the scholar bureaucracy began. The conflict ignited with the Great Rites Controversy. According to the officials, Jiajing, who had ascended the throne from a collateral branch of the imperial family, was supposed to posthumously refer to his own father as imperial uncle, effectively demoting his lineage. This was not merely a matter of titles. It was a power play by the bureaucracy to put the new emperor in his place. But they underestimated the political cunning and iron will of the 15-year-old ruler. Jiajing defied the entire court, even resorting to public floggings, the court bastinado, to beat his opponents into submission. He ultimately triumphed, securing the posthumous title of emperor for his father and, in doing so, asserting the supremacy of his own authority. This victory gave him his first taste of the thrill of political struggle and taught him a crucial lesson. To control everything, one must not be bound by any rules. After this direct confrontation, Jiajing rapidly evolved his strategy, developing a supreme political form we might call offshore balancing. He realized that if he held the cake of power too tightly, everyone would try to snatch it from him. Why not, then, simply toss the cake out and let them fight over it? While he remained behind the scenes as the sole, ultimate arbiter, he began by personally elevating one of history's most notorious corrupt officials, Yan Song, to the position of Grand Secretary. He gave Yan Song the seat of power, tacitly permitting his corruption and cronyism, turning him into a lightning rod for all political criticism. Simultaneously, Jiajing secretly nurtured a pure faction of officials led by figures like Zhu Ji and Gao Gong, allowing them to gather strength in the shadows. This created a perfect, terrifying equilibrium. To protect his power and his life, Yan Song had to cling to Jiajing like a dog. To overthrow Yan Song, Zhu Ji and his allies had to kneel before Jiajing and beg for his support. The power of judgment always remained in Jiajing's hands, and so, Jiajing sat serenely in the western park, seemingly ignoring the affairs of state, while in reality, he had turned everyone into a piece on his personal chessboard. he delegated power to the cabinet and the eunuchs of the Directorate of Ceremonial, letting them fight, scheme, and struggle, while he remained the eternal, indispensable center of power. He could control everything without doing anything, achieving a state of Taoist perfection where to approve 10,000 things is not as good as to remain silent. With his genius for political maneuvering, this brilliant emperor created for himself the perfect environment to neglect his duties for decades and focus on his alchemical pursuits. Yet, this masterpiece of power manipulation was not aimed at strengthening the nation or achieving a golden age. It was all for the selfish purpose of attaining personal immortality. He became obsessed with concocting and consuming elixirs laden with heavy metals like lead and mercury, which only served to make his temperament more erratic, suspicious, and cruel. It was this obsession that planted the seeds for the Renyan Palace incident, and it was this same obsession that forced the entire Ming dynasty to pay a terrible price. Because of the emperor's neglect and the court's internal strife, the northern borders were left vulnerable. In 1550, the Mongol leader Altan Khan led his cavalry to the very gates of Beijing, burning and looting the suburbs in what became known as the Jiangsu incident. In the southeast, corruption, particularly that of Yan Song and his son, left the coastal defenses in shambles, allowing the Wokou pirates, a mix of Japanese marauders and Chinese smugglers, to ravage several provinces. The Great Ming dynasty, from top to bottom, from within and without, was gripped by a deep, systemic crisis. The imperial edifice was beginning to crumble, and yet, the emperor, high and aloof, remained hidden in his Taoist temples in the western part, engrossed in composing green verses, elegant poems addressed to the gods. Many who have watched acclaimed TV series about this era admire Jiajing's political genius, seeing him as a formidable emperor. But they forget that a brilliant strategist is not the same as a competent ruler. The duty of a good emperor is to protect his people and ensure the prosperity of his nation. Jiajing, however, treated the entire empire as a tool for his personal gratification, callously disregarding the life and death of his subjects. As the official Hai Rui cried out in his famous memorial, the Jianshu, "Does the sovereign father know? In the 2 capitals and 13 provinces, all are infants starving and waiting to be fed, fish and meat waiting to be carved on the block." Jiajing's brilliance, far from being a tool for good governance, became an instrument of national disaster. This is his greatest tragedy. From this perspective, the Jiajing emperor, who sat at the pinnacle of power and seemed to control everything, accomplished nothing of value in his entire life. He left behind a shattered empire and a legacy endlessly debated and lamented by posterity. But the story of Jiajing's absurdity does not end there. His political artistry was, in fact, a sophisticated form of dereliction of duty. Ruling for 45 years, longer than any other Ming emperor, he abstained from holding court for over 2 decades. This was possible only because of the highly mature cabinet system and bureaucracy of the Ming dynasty. Jiajing needed only to retain final decision-making power and the authority over appointments. The imperial carriage could then run on its own inertia. He outsourced the mountains of paperwork and endless disputes to his cabinet, freeing himself to pursue his leisure. Behind this rule by inaction lay an extreme avoidance of the pressures of his job. After all, being an emperor was a high-risk, high-stress occupation. His relatively relaxed lifestyle may have contributed to his longevity, as he lived to the age of 60. More significantly, he had access to the most advanced medical care and luxurious living conditions of his time. Although he consumed toxic elixirs, their effects were likely mitigated by these top-tier remedies. But what exactly were these immortality pills that so captivated him? One of the most special was the crimson pill of primal purity, whose primary ingredient was horrifying. The first menstrual blood of virgin girls aged 13 or 14, mixed with morning dew from banana leaves and other precious herbs. Jiajing believed this elixir could restore his vitality, grant him youth, and even allow him to father more sons. To this end, he conscripted vast numbers of young girls into the palace. These unfortunate souls were forced to starve themselves to provide the purest ingredients. The slightest mistake, or failure to produce the materials, could result in a savage beating or even death. The Renyan Palace incident was sparked by precisely such an act of cruelty. Under the leadership of a maid named Yang Jianying, the desperate women decided to use the very tools of the emperor's obsession to end his absurd life. Jiajing was also fond of a substance called autumn stone, a white crystalline powder extracted from the urine of young boys. Modern science suggests this substance was a mixture of hormones, which would have had a steroid-like effect, explaining why the aging emperor felt rejuvenated after taking it and became even more devoted to his alchemical pursuits. Whether red lead or autumn stone, these concoctions reflected Jiajing's pathological desire for eternal life and the extreme perversion of humanity that absolute power can produce. He turned his empire into a personal alchemy furnace, burning the blood and tears of countless people to fuel his ethereal dream of ascension. His selfishness was also reflected in his immense greed. Through confiscations and fines, he amassed a staggering personal fortune, which went not to the state treasury but to his private coffers, while the national treasury was empty and soldiers went unpaid. The emperor was wealthier than the state itself, a bitter irony. In his eyes, the empire belonged to his family, to be spent as he wished. His extravagant construction projects, such as expanding the Western Park and building numerous palaces and temples, further strained the nation's finances, and the burden was inevitably passed on to the common people through crushing taxes. Jiajing's intelligence made him the master of power, but his selfishness made him the greatest parasite of the empire. Over 45 years, he dug a massive pit for the Ming dynasty, which his descendants and millions of his subjects would have to fill. To this day, opinions on Jiajing remain polarized. Some praise his political skill, while others condemn him as a self-indulgent tyrant. But when we peer through the mists of history, we find an exceedingly complex man. He was a master strategist and the progenitor of neglectful governance, a connoisseur of art and a sadistic abuser, the ruler of an empire and its greatest prisoner in his life. He demonstrated both the apex and the emptiness of absolute power, leaving behind a profound case study on human nature, desire, and destiny. The story of Jiajing is over, but the questions he left for history will never cease. Perhaps that, in itself, is the only elixir of immortality this Taoist emperor ever truly created.